Welcome back to American Lit 1. I'm Dr. Barry, and we're continuing our study of the great American author Nathaniel Hawthorne. These next couple of stories in the second part of our study here will kind of fall within the realm of science fiction. We tend to think of science fiction as something relatively new, and it is in the grand scheme of things as far as writing. But this is probably our first American science fiction. Both Rappaccini's Daughter, which we'll go over next, and our current story, The Birthmark, are scientific tales or science-based fiction. And they do what fiction does, what science fiction does best. It tells something of a cautionary tale, even a morality tale. So we'll get to our work with Mr. Nathaniel Hawthorne and our story today, The Birthmark. So The Birthmark tells the somewhat tragic tale of a young woman named Georgiana and her husband, the scientist whose name is Elmer. And of course, rounding out our dramatis personae here, we have Elmer's assistant, the sort of small and short and somewhat brutish, as he's described, Aminadab. Right? Elmer's two great loves are number one, science, and number two, his wife. In that order, there is not by accident. This is how it kind of shapes out for him. But he's dedicated to science. He is so dedicated to science, he can only share his love with science with his love for his wife. Okay. He has a beautiful, nearly angelic wife named Georgiana, as we saw in the last portrait. She's beautiful, she's virtuous, but she has a small, minuscule flaw. On anyone else, it might be seen to enhance her beauty, but he can't bear to look at her. Georgiana has a birthmark on her cheek that looks like a hand. Elmer cannot see beyond that. In fact, it becomes the focus of his attention. And in a horrible, cruel move, he tells her that he finds the birthmark shocking. This hurts his wife terribly, as well it should. And the thing is, the birthmark is barely noticeable to anyone else. It doesn't really detract from her beauty, but yet Elmer's obsession with perfection causes him to dream that he can remove the birthmark. And in fact, in his dream, he begins to remove it, and only to find that it is so deeply ingrained that it's attached to her heart and kills her. And this is, of course, as we know from reading the story, this is a measure of foreshadowing. At this point, the birthmark, however, has become so painful to her that Georgiana is willing to risk even death to have it removed just to please her husband. He further pressures her by saying that Pygmalion was not so enraptured with his creation that he will be with her once he removes this thing. Okay, now Pygmalion, for those of you who might not be familiar with the myth, was a sculptor. And one day the sculptor was approached by the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, who asked him to sculpt a statue of her. His work was very well known. He was the best there was. And over the course of creating this statue, he fell in love with it. He adored his creation beyond anything else. And so once the statue was completed, Aphrodite came to look upon it, and she was very pleased because he'd done fantastic work. And she asked him, what can I do for you? How can I reward you for this beautiful statue? He goes, turn me into stone so that I can be with her. She goes, that's it? You want to be turned to stone? He goes, yes. I'm in love with her and I want to be with her. Okay. The story works out. She agrees to grant his wish, and he steps onto the pedestal with her and presses his lips to the statues. And Aphrodite works his magic, only he doesn't feel cold stone beneath his lips, but warm flesh, because Aphrodite and her wisdom turned the statue human so that they could be together. So this is the kind of obsession that Elmer says he will have for his beautiful wife once this hideous to him, barely noticeable to the world at large, birthmark is removed. Elmer shows Georgiana some of his experiments, including a poison that is extremely deadly, but also has the ability to remove blemishes. And so Georgiana asks if that might help her, but she says she needs something more. He says he needs something more invasive. It's a little more difficult than that. Elmer begins treatment with Georgiana without telling her. He says that he keeps it from her because it's a dangerous process. The treatment, of course, is a success. It completely removes the birthmark, but as we know, Georgiana dies. Hawthorne closes the tale with a moral, and he says that Elmer threw away the perfect love, the perfect mate, by trying to cure a perceived imperfection. Okay, so what this is telling us is it is foolish to pursue absolute perfection. It can't be achieved. Right? It is not the domain of men to achieve that sort of perfection, either artificially or organically. We just can't do it. In fact, we should appreciate the beauty that we have, because there is really no beauty in perfection, sad to say. Elmer has a foil, too, as we talked about in the previous video. A foil is someone who is in the story as a comparison to the hero, the protagonist. He's a lesser character that stands stands in contrast to the protagonist. In this case, it's a Minadab. See, a Minadab sees Georgiana for what she really is, for her exquisite and true beauty. And he says that he would, if he had a woman like her, he would never allow her to feel this way. He would appreciate her for her beauty, which he did. And in the end, it's the the brutish, uneducated kind of Igor character here who laughs at Elmer for his foolishness and rebukes him for his destructive nature. Yes. Kind of a heartbreaking little tale of science and man's foolishness, all kind of wrapped up here, which serves in the end as a morality tale for the readers. We understand that that perfection, of course, can't be achieved, and that Elmer was a fool for casting aside what was perfect and beautiful on its own to try to achieve cosmetic perfection. In fact, it can be said that Elmer destroyed her on two levels. He destroyed her spiritually by wrecking her self-esteem, making her feel terrible about herself because of this tiny little birthmark that most young people even found as an enhancement to her beauty. There is a saying that a blank sheet of paper is never truly blank until the first mark has been made to define the empty space. Right? And that's kind of what's happening here. That her beauty is only enhanced by this tiny imperfection that serves to accentuate the rest of it. Okay. So, even though the story is over 100 years old, the principle remains. And this is what goes into classical canonical writing. It carries a lesson for us that is universal and eternal. So remember this in your daily pursuits for love, beauty, and everything else. All right, so that was The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.